Welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to be looking at the period in the aftermath of the War of 1812 that's known as the era of good feelings. So, here are your good feelings objectives. Take a moment and make sure you understand what the information you'll need to know to be able to answer these, and we'll be back to them again at the end. So, the era of good feelings somewhat came out of the political and social aftermath of the War of 1812. As you might remember, we beat the British soundly in the War of 1812. Look, it's an American sailor being crowned by some sort of angel. There's the American flag and the Constitution in the background. Did you know that the Constitution beat a British ship on the high seas that one time? Awesome. And look, we're independent from England still. He's stomping on a crown. All this is so exciting. So, the era of good feelings is usually described as a period of political unity because the Federalist Party dies out. The Hartford Convention, where the Federalists might have considered seceding from the Union and developing and signing their own treaty with England, made them look incredibly foolish. Because, of course, after the Battle of New Orleans, it was very clear to everyone that we won the War of 1812. So here's the Federalist candidate as some sort of monarchical demon, which, maybe is a little much, but they're playing it up. So that helped destroy political support for the Federalists. The death of Alexander Hamilton, who was the beating heart of the Federalist Party, also played a role. But also, westward expansion left the Federalists without a strong base of power, considering they opposed westward expansion as it would lessen the power of New England and the coastal cities. So what you start to see is we see here Federalist candidates in the red and Republican candidates in the green. After 1800, Republicans are going to take control of both houses of Congress and are pretty much never going to give it up. So the Federalists are going to move to more or less political obscurity and irrelevance. The first Bank of the United States is another issue of theoretical contention, but turns out to be consensus. Because, of course, as you remember, the Republicans were against the Bank of the United States, which was chartered back in Washington's administration and given a 20-year charter. So because they were against the Bank of the United States, Madison's administration failed to recharter the bank in the midst of the War of 1812. Here we see the bank vomiting up tons of money. It should be noteworthy here that you see our triumvirs. The three politicians that we introduced last time are generally known as the triumvirate because they represent each of the three areas of the country, and they were very, of course, prominent leaders of their regions. So here we see Henry Clay of Kentucky, we see Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. So with the Bank of the United States going under in the midst of the War of 1812, this led to somewhat of a financial crisis because all of a sudden now we have nothing. We have no organization to organize the money supply, to direct payments to the army or other people. And so we enter into a miniature financial crisis after the war, and the bank is rechartered in pretty much the immediate aftermath of the war. So what we get is the second Bank of the United States, chartered by James Madison. It's a slightly more limited bank than the first one, but it provides many of the same services. And so now Republicans, for the most part, are on board with the national bank. The bank is also determined to be constitutional by the Supreme Court case McCulloch v. Maryland, where the state of Maryland tried to tax the Bank of the United States out of existence, and the Supreme Court decided that they could not do that, sort of tacitly affirming the constitutionality of the bank. So for a lot of Republicans, if their argument was the bank is unconstitutional, McCulloch v. Maryland establishes that, unfortunately for them, the bank is constitutional because judicial review. In the election of 1816, we get one of the more one-sided elections in American history. James Monroe, who you might remember from, here's James Monroe. You might remember him from Washington crossing the Delaware. He was a young officer in the Revolutionary War, and here you see him right behind George Washington. He is able to handily defeat the Federalist candidate, unfortunately named King, who only wins a couple coastal states dependent on trade. And so James Monroe becomes president, and the Republican Virginia dynasty continues, as he's another wealthy planter from Virginia, similar to, of course, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Monroe administration is not super exciting. Most of the policy is directed by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, We do negotiate a disarmament treaty between us and England along the Canadian border and along the Great Lakes. And we decide that Oregon is going to be a joint occupation between us and the British, again, partially affirming our claim to it. And we get the 49th parallel as the border between us and Canada. So exciting and sexy. Actually, much more exciting is Jackson's unauthorized invasion of Florida, which leads to us buying Florida from the Spanish rather than going to war with them. Andrew Jackson invaded Florida to track down some Seminole Native Americans who had been raiding across the border. Hostile Native American tribes often used border crossings as a way to attack American settlers and then steal possessions and then escape back to areas where they felt like the United States wouldn't go. But Jackson doesn't care about things like borders, so he invades Spain. He invades Spanish territory. He attacks the Seminoles, and then just for good measure, he captures the capital of Florida at Pensacola, deposes the Spanish governor there, and then executes a couple of British smugglers, potentially creating a massive international incident. But fortunately, John Quincy Adams is a foreign policy wizard and is able to negotiate both a settlement with England over their dead smugglers and is able to purchase Florida from the Spanish, which more or less affirms in the aftermath Jackson's invasion of Florida. So now we've got Florida, which is exciting. Although for the first 100 or 150 years of us owning Florida, it's more or less an alligator-infested swamp that we're mostly going to ignore. John Quincy Adams also writes something called the Monroe Doctrine, which, of course, Monroe's president, so his name gets to be on it, but it's mostly John Quincy Adams. It's sort of an addendum to Washington's neutrality policy, with the idea that since we're staying out of European affairs, Europeans need to stay out of affairs in the American colonies. Europeans cannot conquer any new colonies, and they need to keep themselves out of the internal affairs of countries in the Americas. This was important at this time because most of Latin America had just won their independence from the Spanish. And so we were seeing a whole bunch of new independent countries like Mexico and Argentina and Venezuela after Gran Colombia fell apart. Anyway, you're starting to see all these Latin American countries gain their independence. And what the United States did not want is for a country like England or Germany, or once Germany becomes a country, to come across and recapture all of these territories, giving Europeans a sort of jumping off point or a foothold on the American continent. So for right now, of course, we have no ability to enforce this. If England wants to go and invade Mexico, we have zero ability to stop them. I mean, honestly, we couldn't stop them from burning down our capital 2 years ago. So there's no way that we could actually stop them from, capturing Mexico. But it's a statement of policy that will become enforceable at some point in the future. So it represents a profound step forward in American foreign policy, despite the fact that right now it's absolutely toothless. This period after the War of 1812 also sees significant population growth as we now have the ability to settle a lot of these westward areas because the power of Native American tribes in the west, both the Creek in the south and the Shawnee and other tribes in the north, have been broken. And so we're going to start to see a significant uptick in the population of the United States. And this, of course, necessitates a whole bunch of other issues that we need to address if we're going to be moving and incorporating these frontier areas into the United States. And so for the election of 1820, everything is pretty much good. James Monroe runs uncontested and wins every electoral vote, with the exception of that one faithless elector in New Hampshire who voted for John Quincy Adams, who again was Monroe's Secretary of State, so not running against him. And so at this point, everyone is a Republican, and James Monroe wins the first uncontested election since 1792. With this, the country embarks on a bipartisan platform of infrastructure building, specifically roads and canals. And we're going to spend more time talking about this in the future because, of course, this is incredibly important. But roads and canals are absolutely necessary to both get products from the frontiers, raw materials and crops, to more urban areas, and also to bring finished products onto the frontier to allow people to live there more comfortably. So this infrastructure, this massive road and canal building project, is going to be undertaken and is going to start tying the new country together, specifically the north, up sort of in the areas that used to be the Middle and New England colonies, to the quote unquote West, and by West we mean Ohio and Indiana. Marshall Court is the other thing, is the other facet of the Monroe administration that we need to briefly talk about, because although the Federalists have died off in the executive and legislative branches, John Marshall is still alive and is still making pseudo-Federalist rulings as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So the Marshall Court is going to lay down a series of Federalist principles affirming broad construction, federal power over state power, and the power of contracts and the federal government's ability to regulate interstate trade. So, although the Federalists and a lot of their strong federal government ideals are now gone, the Marshall Court is still gradually expanding the power of the federal government and affirming the right of Congress to use the Elastic Clause if necessary to, charter a Bank of the United States, or to dig a canal across New York, or to build a road from Washington, D.C. all the way to Ohio. So, just in case anyone needs to do that in the future, these things are now constitutional. So, for our era of good feelings, is it an era of consensus and agreement? What are some of the regional issues that are showing up here? And how does the Monroe Doctrine fit into our previous foreign policy statements? Make sure you can answer these questions substantively, and we'll be back to talk about the market revolution and then eventually watch this happy era of unity break down.